On behalf of the Banyan, and the Banyan Academy of Leadership and Mental Health, we're very, very happy to have you here with us on what promises to be an extremely interesting evening. We're speaking to Professor Ankhi Mukherjee from Oxford University on her latest book, Psychic Lives of the Unseen Poor, Unseen Cities, Psychic Lives of the Urban Poor. This book was 10 years in the making, but before we plunge into the book, I just want to take the privilege of reading out Ankhi's extremely interesting and enviable CV. Ankhi Mukherjee is a professor of English and World Literatures at the University of Oxford and a fellow in English at Wadham College. Her most recent book, Unseen City, The Psychic Lives of the Urban Poor, was published by Cambridge University Press in December 2021. Her second monograph, What is a Classic? Postcolonial Rewriting and Invention of the Canon, won the British Academy Rosemary Crochet Prize in English Literature in 2015. Mukherjee's other publications include Aesthetic Hysteria, The Great Neurosis in Victorian Melodrama and Contemporary Fiction, and the collections of essays she has edited, namely A Concise Companion to Psychoanalysis, Literature and Culture, and After Lacan. Mukherjee has published in competitive peer-reviewed journals, including PMLA, MLQ, Contemporary Literature, Parallax, and the Cambridge Journal of Postcolonial Literary Inquiry, and sits on the editorial board of several international journals. She has been a postdoctoral research fellow of the British Academy, a visiting fellow at the Humanities Research Centre at Australian National University, and the John Hinckley Professor at Johns Hopkins University. At present, Mukherjee has 2 books under contract. She is writing a very short introduction to postcolonial literature in the widely circulated BSI series and co-editing a collaborative volume titled Decolonizing the English Literary Curriculum, which has been promised an initial run of 25,000 copies. So thank you so much for joining us today. And like we discussed, I'm going to keep my interaction and my questions to a minimum, just some thoughts that are in all our heads and questions that have been passed on to me. So thanks very much, Ankhi, for joining us. And can you now tell us a little bit about yourself? Because before we get to your work, your CV, like I said, is so enviable, and you are a scholar of literature, but have decided to pursue some writing in the science of the mind. So can you tell us a little bit about your personal journey, and then we'll come to the book.
Thank you so very much, Mrinalini. And before I start, I'd like to thank Dr. Gopi Kumar. I'd like to thank you and the Banyan team. I'd like to thank Lakshmi Narasimhan and Keertana Ram, who helped me write the case studies which went into Unseen City. And I just want to say that this is the very first event related to Unseen City that's happening in India. And it's very special to me that it's happening in Chennai. I have a very deep sort of spiritual connection to South India, and I've been through Chennai at least 50 times. I've stayed for days here, maybe 10 times. So it feels very special to come back with my book to this beautiful city, to this vibrant intellectual city, and to also sort of be under the shade of the Banyan. So thank you very much. It's very special. That's why I dressed up, because I wanted to celebrate this moment. And as far as my trajectory, I would say my primary literary interest is Victorian literature and culture. And when I was doing my PhD at Rutgers University, one of the things that I found fascinating was, in a way, the histrionic disorder I saw in Victorian literature. So, unpublished nautical melodramas dating back to the 1820s, where the British sailor figure, an iconic figure of British masculinity in the post-Napoleonic wars, was actually being hysterical. So not a woman, but a man. And that too, this figure of British patriotism and British overseas prowess, the sailor. And I found that very interesting. And that led to my looking at the melodramatic and the hysterical in Victorian literature. And alongside, I plotted a sort of trajectory of how hysteria was kind of in a way made into a discourse by Charcot, by Sigmund Freud, etc. And I think what was different about my PhD was I was not applying Freudian theory to 19th century literature no one knew, but I was actually saying, look at the food chain where, Dickens watches nautical melodramas and Freud reads Dickens and hysteria is created. So I was kind of, claiming a pole position for literature. And keep in mind that, some of these melodramas were not even, they were not meant to be read. They were sort of like meant to be seen. So, and then, of course, I wrote what is a classic, which doesn't have a single word of psychoanalysis. And while I was writing it, around 2010 or 2011, I seriously wondered why I had kind of moved so far away from a kind of mode of psychoanalytic thinking, which had shaped my PhD. And the answer was, I think I found very little to relate in metropolitan psychoanalysis that I could relate to. I mean, I kind of felt, and maybe this is an unfair accusation, I felt as if, like almost this entire thing of suffering had dropped out. And it was all about a certain kind of, sort of, I'm getting therapized, I'm getting to know myself better and having my truths returned. This was around the same time that I read this wonderful works on a social democratic moment in Freudian psychoanalysis, where he, in a 1918, a kind of very famous Budapest conference, had said that there should be psychoanalysis for the poor, that it's as essential as life-saving surgery. And this was a sort of speech act from which, a mental health cooperative movement sprang up in Europe. And it went all the way to the US. It had repercussions in India. And so, I started out, when I was writing What is a Classic, which is not psychoanalytic at all, I revisited that moment of my PhD where I really saw that interimplication of literature and psychoanalysis. But I also wanted to kind of deal with a form of psychoanalysis that was international, that was, social democratic, that was kind of, that had a sort of, humanitarian aim and scope. And that was also kind of, in a way, very dialogic. The kind of the proponents of the free clinic movement were actually talking to each other, and they were devising ways in which psychoanalysis could be kind of, brought out of privileged domains through the engagement of lay counselors. And that really appealed to me, that in a way, that relay of training and skills, where someone like Freud would train somebody, and that person would train another person in return, to kind of, in a way, cater to the needs of society. So that's the kind of trajectory of the three books. My day job is I'm a professor of English literature. So both English and world literatures. I teach 18th, 19th, 20th, 21st century literature. But I'm also kind of always had a very strong interest in the history of medicine, in particular, the history of psychoanalysis.
Very nice. Thank you. Thank you so much. And we know that these two worlds are so connected, but we hardly really get to see it happen and get to read about it in an accessible way, and really hope that your book sort of opens us up to more such inquiries, especially in the Indian subcontinent, because we've also had a very interesting journey with our own theories, which often get sidelined, and how they can be connected to the present. So now I'd like to ask you a little bit about your book. What made you want to write it, and just it's like I said in the beginning, it was 10 years in the making. So what thought went into it, and just describe your journey a little bit.
Yes, and the spurs are often, I ask this question when I'm kind of examining somebody in a viva. I often ask them, what made you want to write this book? And I'm always more intrigued by nonsensical answers, that I saw this movie and this made me want to write a PhD, which would, sap 5 to 7 years of my life. And I find those answers very interesting. And for me, it was a combination of, kind of my introspecting on why I had found psychoanalysis no longer relatable, and also a certain kind of, in a way, rage I felt toward certain almost pornographic depictions of poverty. I was telling you earlier, Mrinalini, that I saw Slumdog Millionaire, and it really it was very popular in the West, and made my blood boil that, this concept, which I think is a very pejorative and pernicious one for countries such as ours, that people who live in poverty should be seen as a collective. They are these kind of hordes. They're the primal hordes. So they don't have an unconscious. They are the unconscious. And often, this quotation is attributed to Freud, who actually had a very complex relationship to the idea of the non-Western. It's not as simple as he thought they were the unconscious. But and I thought that, Slumdog Millionaire, where, this child has to escape the slums and reach the kind of, the call center and thereby become the center of the center, any center that matters. And then his vantage point of the slums is not ground up, but from a skyscraper that's being built. I mean, this is kind of like being touted as a sort of Bildungsroman, a growth narrative. And so, but what happens to the people who are left behind? It doesn't really change their lives. It's the story of this one person, and even his success is not seen as systematic. It's sort of accidental. It's fortuitous. So I mean, really, like things like that used to always like bother me, that why, how is it that we can't really think about kind of poor populations as having interior psychic lives, kind of minds, internal conflict, and why is it that we always think that the slum person is this person covered in debris and shit and sort of recycling garbage? I mean, this was, and then I also kind of around the same time, so 2012 2013, I read a crop of nonfiction, which was, for instance, Catherine Boo's Behind the Beautiful Forevers, which was kind of really trying to like provide a very anti-romantic view of poverty, saying, look at this family, look at these two families in Annawadi slum who are fighting because one family wants to build a wall or kind of build something that distinguishes itself from the other families. So saying that it's not just the poor who want gated communities, but not just the rich who want gated communities, but the poor want to set themselves apart from the others. And this kind of a very anti-romantic but deep and close and embodied engagement with the lives of the poor is something that I really gravitated to. I come from a country where the title of the book is Unseen City. It's taken from a bit in Satanic Verses by Salman Rushdie, where he talks about the migrant ghettos of London, and he describes them as city visible but unseen. And we are masters. We in India, from the middle class or the upper classes, we are masters of this particular avoidance mechanism, where we see this, we see the suffering, and we kind of walk away. We say, no, I'm not going to give that money because that money will be used up in drugs. And I mean, I'm sure I don't really want to worry about my maid where she lives, because she must live in some sort of rundown accommodation and not the slums that are being flooded routinely. So, this, I really kind of wanted to take myself there and ask certain uncomfortable questions of my own position as I tried to sort of, take psychoanalysis to these kind of, these kind of precarious lives and habitats.
Thank you so much. I just want to ask you one question about, gated communities and the poor wanting to also, set a space aside for themselves. And you spoke about Slumdog Millionaire, where he has to go to the call center and, start looking at his past life from top down and not bottom up. To this end, I want to understand what happens, how the view of the larger society, or the people who have a voice, and the people who largely the majority that ends up writing these narratives without really going in depth into real lives like you have. How do those voices impact the connection between two people coming from the same background?
Could you please repeat like the last bit of the question? So you mean?
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
What I wanted to ask is, the majoritarian view, or the slumdog millionaires that become hits, and so those views, how do you think it impacts the conversation, the dynamic, and the relationship between two people living in the slums? Their interaction. How do you think these majoritarian views impact those interactions?
So as I think, I don't think there's anyone in this group who thought Slumdog Millionaire was a great movie. So, people who understand cinema, people who watch sort of intelligent cinema would have seen as a sort of a bit of nonsense, But I do think that there is something very pernicious about thinking that the slum habitat is something that needs to be outgrown, that needs to be escaped from. And that's a very peculiar escapist and also kind of in a way, hands-off way of thinking about the role of the slum in the constitution of the city and the role of the city's infrastructure in keeping the slum a slum. So yes, I mean, in my work, I wanted to show that, our lives are kind of deeply, eh, intertwined. This is providing a kind of labor, and that most kind of growing economies need. It's providing sort of a shelter for surplus populations, and more importantly, I mean, and this is the work of a lot of sort of urban geographers and anthropologists in, let's say, a slum like Dharavi, show how intelligent and user generated these slums are. So this is not to be escaped. This needs to be kind of in a way improved. It needs to be kind of flooded with resources. It needs to be flooded with kind of concerns about healthcare and about mental health, and not see, because it can only happen to, I mean, first of all, just the term slum dog, I don't think there's any kind of Indian vernacular language equivalent. I don't think we call people who live in slum dogs, and the closest equivalent in the movie is kutta. I mean, this is just like, it's obscene. You cannot possibly enjoy a movie that is making it normalizing the calling of slum children dogs. So yes, I mean, I did, as I said, I really felt rage, because this was seen as a very sweet little, coming of age story where this person escapes and is given a chance. But we don't want that kind of, contingency to change the lives of the disenfranchised. We need to sort of have much more systematic, interlinked, joined up thinking behind poverty alleviation, that goes to the slum, that looks at the resourcefulness and resilience of slum residents, and tries to strengthen their hand. So this is what I have tried to do in the book, that, I mean, in a way, I'm showing how I'm not sort of saying that, let's all go and live in, kind of South Mumbai, that's ridiculous. That can only happen in these absurd movies, but what I'm saying is that, look, I mean, and that's something Catherine Boo does as well, looks at the deep sort of like a deep-seated ambition in a group of boys who are garbage traders, but how they are, kind of like, they are building something that sadly is something that is eventually razed to the ground, but they're setting aside money for a solid house, they're setting aside money for education, for a sister's wedding. So there are these sort of aspirational narratives that really need to be captured, because that look from the top down is pernicious and pejorative, and it can be, both this pornographic look, but also thinking of empathy and charity. I'm very suspicious of those. We all have that. We all want to kind of like, seem very, I mean, they don't, these kind of like, the survivalism of these residents of slums. They don't need your pity or your charity. They need a very different kind of engagement. They need sort of very knowledge based, very, they need barefoot researchers. We need to kind of like go into the communities and train and you of course, Banyan, know everything about this. So that's kind of, that was more the intervention. I thought that those of us who are privileged, those of us who have, kind of taken this art of unseeing the visible city to an extreme, we need to kind of like really start retooling ourselves with.
Thank you. No, when you said they need a very different kind of engagement, they don't need charity. Where does equity fall into this? Because one of the last lines that I said we'll come to, but the equity of the unconscious. So where does equity fall in place in our interaction and our engagement and in our genuinely making things better and for sustainable periods of time?
Thank you. I'm very glad you asked me that question. So you see, for this book, the starting point was the free clinic movement, which started with Freud in 1918, which flourished between 1918 and 1938. And one of the things psychoanalysis in that paradigm, it's Freudian psychoanalysis is not the only psychoanalysis, but one of the things in that paradigm is it's not just looking at curing malady, but it's looking at bestowing interiority. It's looking at validating someone's dreams. It's looking at the way in which somebody can become a sovereign subject. Someone can have a psyche. So one of the things that I do to go back to that quote that the poor are not the unconscious, they have an unconscious. So equity of an unconscious is what I mean, because psychoanalysis activates that. It kind of like, it values that it's very important for me to know how you dream. It's very important for me to know what the disfluences in your life are, because that's what makes you special. And I'm sure, you come across this every day in your work at Banyan, that despite the same kinds of stressors, despite the same kind of adversities, not everyone's is affected in the same way. So the singularity of the life is to be seen in the singularity of the way in which their unconscious behaves. So when I said equity of unconscious, I meant, and this is denying poor people and unconscious is also sort of like behind this idea. And you would be shocked to see how many psychoanalysts say this, that certain people are not analyzable. So they can't sustain analysis because, they can't think. So this is something I really wanted to contest, because in all the community interventions, that's exactly what is being challenged. That no, they can, though they don't have language, though these are people for whom, let's say, English is transactional or Hindi is transactional, they can still sustain a kind of, they can still sustain a conversation on their terms, where they're able to articulate what it is that is making them disfluent and reach fluency, reach capability. So equity of unconscious is kind of saying that they too have the sort of deep topography of mind, the unconscious, the subconscious, the conscious minds that the rest of us, assume, I mean, I can get therapized, it's like going and getting coffee, it doesn't really involve very much more than that, in my stage in life. Whereas for a poor person, we don't think they need it at all. And I was saying to you yesterday, Mrinalini, that, the use of the term self-care that you use in your shelters, it just really made me feel so sort of, in a way, bad about the other kind of more narcissistic ways in which we use self-care. I'm really burnt out from reading 50 emails. I need a day of self-care. Whereas, you are using the term self-care in relation to teaching someone how to brush their teeth again, or teaching someone to take a bath again. And I do think that when I say equity of unconscious, I'm looking at all these technologies that have to be put in place, where we not just give people packets of food, but we say, you have a mind, and I'm interested in your mind, in the stability and in the good functioning of your mind, the healthy functioning of your mind. And I want to sort of respect your unconscious. That's what I meant.
Thank you. So that makes things a lot clearer, and it's so in line with the conversations that we've been having. So now, if we can jump into the book and talk about some of the your interesting experiences, and maybe a case study or two. I think the audience will be very happy to hear of them.
So let me just open the book, because I obviously don't want to be misrepresenting anyone. I thought I'd give you a case study from one of my collaborators. So this is the Tavistock Trust in London. And so it's sort of let me just get that very quickly. Yeah.
Sure.
So this is a Tavistock Trust, which is, it's a non-profit public benefit organization, which provides over half of the NHS, which is the National Health Service, public funded healthcare system in the UK. So it provides half of the NHS's mental health provision. And I was very lucky, I was fairly, as I know, kind of, Lakshmi and Keertan, I would tell you, if I'm interested in an organization, I'm shameless. I keep sending emails, and I kept saying, is there anything I can, because they are actually providing psychoanalysis for free. So I kept kind of, knocking on the doors, and Julian Stern, who's the head of Tavistock, he took pity on me, and he said, we have just the thing for you, and sent me to this. This was actually probably one of the happiest moments of the book, where I spent time with two Turkish psychotherapists in a garden doing, the conditions of my grant was that I could not really interact with people with psychosocial disability directly, but I could kind of, in a way, interact with them through the therapists. So yes, so this is the horticultural therapy. It takes place in Hackney. And so I'll just give you a few details about how this works. So these are mostly Turkish women. These are you can see all the details of, what this community is like. It's a very impoverished community. And many of the women they used to be sort of, day wage laborers in Turkey, and they have arrived, and perilous journeys involving trafficking and rape and all kinds of, violations of themselves. And they have landed in London, and they are, while they are kind of, for the most part, functional, they're not psychotic, they also have a panoply of kind of neurotic disorders which enable them to have full lives. And the really sort of scary thing, I have many case studies from this, I'll only read one. The very scary thing about this is that these women have, or there's some men as well, and the case study I will read out today involves a man. These women have made the rounds of the general practitioners, or GPs as we call them, GP surgeries, over sometimes 10 years, but they have not been able to convey what was wrong with them, and therefore they have not been able to get the treatment they needed. And these Turkish women had been labeled MUS, or medically unsolved cases, medically unsolved stories. And the Tavistock group, the horticultural group of the Tavistock, they call it, they don't call it medically unsolved. They say they think of it as, kind of in a way, they think of it as untold stories, not unsolved. So, and it's absolutely miraculous how the fact that the Turkish psychotherapists talk to these Turkish women in Turkish languages, and the fact that they, instead of sort of in a way having a traditional psychoanalytic, psychoanalytic dyad, they actually have group therapy involving other Turkish people, and they do it primarily through gardening. They plant things, they grow things, they put their hands in the soil, they grow crops, and they cook the crops, and they sit in a shed. There are pictures in my book. They sit in a shed, and that shed, those chairs, that's the analyst's couch. So the two psychotherapists take them through different kinds of issues that they may be facing in their life. And not only do they take help from the psychotherapists, they help each other. So I'll just read out one case study from there. Right. So keep in mind that most of the participants in the horticultural group, it's primarily women, but there are some men. They have no formal education, and many of them are illiterate in their own language. So they can't write their own language. And they were menial laborers, and each has had to deal with very intrusive scrutiny of the authorities to prove their eligibility for benefits, from the healthcare system. Ahmed Kagla, the integrative psychotherapist in charge of the group project, states in his report of this thriving initiative that almost all the participants have long-term physical debilitations, yet they have almost no insight into possible links between their physical symptoms and early emotional traumas and losses. To address this traumatic dissociation, the gardening therapy includes psychoeducation about the body in the form of mindfulness and grounding exercises. It sensitively addresses self-stigmatization the patients suffer from, relatable to the internalization of prejudice, hopelessness, and a debilitating lack of confidence. One of the major tasks of the group work is to reverse this pattern, Kagla states, and try to build resilience and capacity. This is achieved primarily through creating a safe environment in the horticultural group, training the members in principles of nonviolent communication and constructive criticism. Kagla mentions the Turkish word sohbet. I mean, we have this in Bengali as well. We call it shohobot or sahabat. The deep intrapsychic conversation between therapist and group and between fellow members to explain the transformative connections this school of therapy aspires to. Sohbet is a form of social glue. Kagla cites a saying in Turkish that you can miss or postpone a ritual prayer, which has to be performed at certain intervals in the day, but you can't postpone a sohbet. Psychodynamic, emotion-focused, and experiential therapeutic methods, which I discuss in great detail in the book, are used in this form of group therapy to triangulate person and conflict, understand patterns of repression, and help patients become aware of inhibitions, avoidances, and devious workings of defenses and anxiety. Kagla presents the case of a 57-year-old man, a shopkeeper with no record of mental illness, whose life takes a tragic turn following a road accident. His physical injury was not considered severe, and he was discharged from hospital in a day. However, he deteriorates rapidly after this event, losing almost all of his meager language skills. Withdrawn, forgetful, unable to leave the house, the only words he can muster are I do not know. At first, the group coordinators are not sure he should join the gardening project, but they invite him anyway and he agrees to come. As the weeks progress, he starts working actively in the gardening segment of the sessions and begins to share stories of his life. He has small interactions with those around him and shows interest in their lives, asking questions from time to time. In 6 months, he's the most loved group member, Kagla observes. 3 months after the gardening cohort disbands, the therapists have a review meeting with the man who arrives with his wife. They are smiling and happy. He says that he's working with his son now, going out, carrying on with life. His relationships are more fulfilling and relaxed, says the man, who during his first assessment could not string together answers. And this is, I'm citing from the case notes here, was not able to clear his nose when he cried. What happened to this man during this time in the group may seem mysterious, Kagla muses. So I have written about this. I've talked about faith healers and how this can also, I've compared this to faith healers. That wouldn't make very sense because I haven't talked about that now. But it's one of my observations is that, the therapy in St. Mary's Garden is about a truth in parallax, which restores functionality and capability in a world where historical truths kill. And so I talk about a kind of Turkish story where a little girl, so it happens in the garbage hills just outside Istanbul. And a little girl, when the government bulldozers come to raise the slum, she gets hysterical. She starts tearing her hair. And you know that this has something to do with the destruction because all she's holding is a brick. She finds it absolutely devastating. And she's taken to a faith healer who can't see, but who, despite his blindness, can actually see through the suffering of the poor, of his peers. And he he unties the girl's hands. The mother had tied the hands because she was tearing her hair out. And so this idea of, the hands are untied literally and figuratively. And the Gulu Baba, who's the faith healer, says to this little girl that go rebuild your home. And similarly, I do think this is what happens in Kagla's assessment. The care and compassion provided by the group in a safe and non-judgmental environment helped this man to connect. This, I'm talking about Kagla's notes. Kagla, the Tavistock-trained psychotherapist, helped this man to connect to the healing potential which we all have as he returns to the quotidian endurance of a care-filled life. So I'll stop there. And there are many such kind of case studies which seem simple, but they involve very intricate work on the part of the psychotherapists. Kind of really knowing what to say, really also knowing what not to say, really knowing when not to say anything at all, and when to let the gardening sort of do the healing work, and to let the group do the healing work, the group of the kind of the clients.
Thank you. That was just so amazing. And, there are studies and now theories about using your hands, how integral it becomes to, unlocking parts of your mind that you've put away for a long time. We talked about, people who have really undergone systemic they've really been subjected to a lot of systemic barriers and every stage of their life subjected to a lot of trauma as a result of socio-political structures that are not really in their control. In your experience and in your research, have you identified groups that look at dissemination of history or a group's or an oppressed group's collective history to alleviate some of the distress and the repression that they go through? Where does history come into play?
So where history...
So I think there was a mild interruption. Can you hear me?
Yes. So where history comes in the picture, there are lots of sort of, urban studies, reports, lots of sort of geographical data on, let's say, the Turkish community in Hackney. But this kind of well-rounded thinking where it connects the poverty, the fact that most of the sufferers of MUS are women, and the lack of connection of that with the fact that actually many of the women don't work. They're often in kind of, household situations involving very serious IPV, interpersonal violence. And many of them, I mean, they are not educated, they don't have English language. So the history is there. The economists are producing reports about Turkish communities and how underperforming they are in Hackney. The geographers are looking at, the density of kind of, households and lack of hygiene. But no one is kind of in a way using these kind of different forms of knowledge to shed light on the particular dysfunctioning or non-functioning of this group. And I do think that, to some extent, psychoanalysis is, that's, Lacan's word. Lacan used hysteria and histoire interchangeably. In the hysteria is the history. It is a sort of histrionic performance.
You're also listening to that, right? Okay.
That's not true for me.
Is it still an issue? Okay. Oh, I think okay. I think whoever's not whoever's not speaking may please mute themselves, because yeah.
And in the case of, again, when I worked with the program for torture survivors at Bellevue Hospital, I mean, there are lots of reports on, let's say, the Rohingyas, because New York is this kind of and the torture survivors program was another very fascinating kind of program I observed, because there you have slaves from Mauritania, you have Rohingyas, you have people who have escaped genocidal civil wars in kind of West Africa, and they're all in one spot. They're all in one spot, and they're all being treated by psychiatrists who are increasingly resorting to psychotherapeutic methods to talk to these people and kind of really, to some extent, challenging that the dominance of kind of pharmacotherapy. These are psychiatrists; they are administering the drugs, but they're also saying that's not enough. And there are histories of how the Rohingya came to New York, or for instance, I worked in Harlem with a therapeutic nurse, and it's just one of the hardest things I did, and that's why I think the section is also quite short. I found it very difficult to work there, where it's kind of children who are abused, and I kind of thought children, maybe teenagers, but they were as young as 3 or 4, and they were abused. And it's a therapeutic nursery where a not a Tavistock trained, William Alanson White, one of the great sort of psychoanalytic training institutes in the Upper West Side, William Alanson White Institute trained psychoanalyst was offering her services in the community to look after these extremely traumatized children. And the history is there. The history is that of the afterlives of slavery, and the way in which the kind of, in a way, they call it the ghost in the nursery, how systemic oppression, absolutely brutalizing racism, brutalizing ghettoization of the Black body has resulted in a certain kind of violence, violence inflicted to the self, to the child. So the histories are there. And here, in the suffering, I've almost always tried to connect it to larger infrastructural, systemic, historical issues, not just looking. And I think that's exactly the triangulation I'm talking about. It's not just the patient, analyst dyad, but it's culture, it's society, it's history. And that's an extremely important thing that I have looked at. I have looked in the New York chapter, I've looked very closely at the way in which a certain kind of I've used Christina Sharp's term "in the wake." In the wake of slavery, in the wake both means in the aftermath, in the wake of a death, in the aftermath of slavery, but also in the wake, meaning that, this awakening, the awakening of modernity, that our modernity itself is based on colonization and slavery. And it's, it's often easy to remember that, I live and teach, live in Oxford and teach at Oxford, where we have a slaver statue, the statue of Cecil Rhodes, and just being awake or to the fact that so many of these organizations and institutions have been funded by the blood of slavery. So that I've connected what we are seeing in the 21st century to these legacies. and the work is there, it's just not kind of always connected, so there is work, of course, and why there is violence toward children in a certain group of African American households, but it's not always sort of done in such a way that lets the individual story speak to the particular legacies of the trauma, and the group is not just sort of all sort of depicted in the same identical way.
Got it. No, and I think that's why your work resonated so much with us and continues to resonate with us, because we work, I mean, as everybody who's here knows, we work with the homeless, and that has been that has had a bit of a checkered history. There is, I don't think there has been any generation or any time period where the homeless weren't oppressed or subjected to embarrassment, trauma, abuse, what have you. But I think the past 200 years of colonial legacies of the beggary law and our vagrancy acts that really stand to label the homeless and people who don't really have who live on the street because they don't have any other choice, people who are ostensibly poor, they've been put behind bars for as long as 10 years because they look a certain way, and you're being punished for your poverty, and that is a system that has refused to really budge for the past 200 years. And now I think there are laws that are making the beggary laws illegal, and they're undoing them. But largely, I think it stems from a place of punishing people for being poor and punishing people for looking a certain way or being a certain way, and that law has been taken advantage of in so many different ways, whether it's during the Commonwealth Games or even on a day-to-day basis, where homeless people are seen as a nuisance on the streets, and these colonial laws are used and misused to further oppress them and push them to the margins. So I mean, that's why for us, as those who work with the homeless, it resonated a great deal. But you've spent some time with us over the past 3 days, and you've also learned about the work of the Banyan through Lakshmi and Kirtana. Outside of the Banyan universe, I just wanted to hear your thoughts on where the homeless stand in this universe, because you've written about the urban poor, and the homeless are an even more invisible community. So in your years of observation and in the last 3 days that you've spent, where do you stand on the lives of the homeless in this entire tapestry, as it were?
So chapter 6, which is called Psychoanalysis of the Unhomed, and these are the free clinics in New York. The very first case study, the very first, not the very first, but the second study is on TLC, which is transitional living community. And in a way, so this is the kind of, this is one of the biggest shelters for the homeless poor in New York City. And I was saying this to kind of Vandana yesterday, that they provide a shelter, and one of the first things I asked you as well is that how long are they allowed to stay? So in this case, they're allowed to stay for the duration that they finish writing the housing pack. So, one of where the homeless stay in this was a kind of really eye-opening moment for me, because when I saw the housing pack, I think someone with a kind of like primary education or primary and secondary education would probably be able to finish that housing pack in a week, if not in the hours of a day. But sometimes it takes some of the residents of TLC up to 2 years to finish it, because there are all kinds of relapses. There are all kinds of things that come up when they're asking for housing, and they are while they're at TLC, they're undergoing, they're often undergoing psychiatric treatment themselves, and there are different kinds of schizoaffective disorders and depression and paranoia that they're dealing with. These residents are dealing with PTSD, etc. And where they stand is that I think one of the very key things that was eye-opening for me in my work with the homeless shelter was that so much of poverty alleviation is about about, I mean, you see this in a kind of a lot of economic, discourses of self-improvement, that the person who's making the decision is a rational one. The person who is, and therefore economics, that kind of model of economic self-discovery or self-recovery is very predicated on the assumption that the decision-making person is kind of compos mentis, is rational. And here was somebody who was struggling to finish a housing pack in years. So I do think that we need to revise that economic model of recovery, which is not really, which is rigged from the start, which does not take into consideration the lives of somebody, who has this kind of the person I worked with is a Harvard-trained psychiatrist called Tony Stern. He said it's this unholy trio of, of course, paranoia, narcissism, and hopelessness. And he sees this a lot in the kind of residents he treats. And so yes, I mean, it was extraordinary to me that we kind of think that this kind of very neoliberal model of people can pull themselves up by their bootstraps, but not quite addressing that very sort of the fact that the mind is wandering too, and the mind needs to be sort of in a way tethered in the body before they can start even think about self-improvement. And so yes, it was an extraordinarily eye-opening thing for me that even something like this, where there is provision for housing, they're not able to complete that housing, and this charity had specifically identified that and said that we'll do something very product oriented. And in the process, there was talk therapy, there was kind of in a way coordination by the psychiatrist of the person's social housing needs, but also psychiatric needs. And I found that a very, very interesting model. So yes, I mean, I do think, and this is something I really liked about I mean, this is something both Hari and others told me yesterday, that, not just leaving a packet of food with the homeless. This is describing the outreach work, which I witnessed as well a little bit. But asking them how they are, asking them what they need, asking them, I mean, they were asking this old man who had a bandaged foot, that what has happened to your foot? And, he went into this entire story, which Purnima very kindly translated for me, that he had a car had fallen on top of him, and and so sort of this is exactly what happens in the shelter. The psychiatrist like talks to them, and what is it that want to, and I could, if you have a little bit of time, I could kind of in a way tell you one of the kind of very quick case studies from there, which I really like. So most of the people in the homeless shelter are African American. That's another story that I kind of like briefly addressed. There's another sort of context. So there's this 63-year-old African American man. He has carried the diagnosis of schizophrenia most of his life, and he has this kind of Tony Stern. These case studies were written by Tony Stern, and he says he presents with a very flat affect, and he talks in a very disjointed fashion. And there are these kind of open door sessions where Tony sits in his office and he asks the residents, he doesn't make appointments, he says, you can come in and talk to me. So he says, it's our job to help you feel comfortable here, also to help you get what you want. And this person, who, let's call him Joe, he nods. The psychiatrist said, what do you want, Joe? Joe says, money. The psychiatrist says, what will money buy you? Joe says, housing. And psychiatrist says, it's our other priority to find you housing. And Joe says, mom and dad, they live down in Florida, they paid. And then the psychiatrist said, but you'd like to pay for your own place like them? And Joe says, I want to lead a normal life like anyone. And in the conversation that ensues, Stern observes how Joe's self-assessment is abnormal and kind of tinged with perpetual sadness about life's outcomes. And he sees also how somebody who he had first described as having a flat affect, this is exact words, flat affect, very, very classic sort of description of schizophrenia, somebody with schizophrenia. And he says that he becomes animated. And while the thought processes are sometimes harder to follow, the patient speaks, the Stern says, with a new aliveness. Because what has been engaged with is not saying, I'll help you get housing, but what do you want? And why do you want it? When your parents have already said they'll pay, why do you want housing on your own? So you see, I mean, I can't obviously go into a lot of detail with any of these, but you can see that just this conversation, and the old man we were speaking to, he came alive, he was sort of like lecturing the young activists from Banyan about, what he knows about homelessness. But again, giving him that power that, you talk to us and we are not just talking down to you. I find that extraordinarily productive and kind of constructive that I saw at TLC, and that I also kind of, glimpsed at in the Banyan work.
Thank you so much. And I think that again brings us back to equity of the unconscious, right? Yeah, that's absolutely amazing. So, I mean, I will open the dais out to the audience for questions, but while they formulate their questions, I want to ask you. I already know this, but I think it's very interesting for the larger audience. What's next?
I'm in the process. I mean, there are 2 books under contract that I'm writing. One is a very short introduction to postcolonial literature, and this is kind of more to do with my academic work. I'm also doing a book called Decolonizing the English Literary Curriculum, which is a very important, it's an extremely important issue of our times, because to some extent, the curriculum and pedagogy is very key to the way in which these civilizational divides are created between self and other, civilized and uncivilized, and metropolis and colonial periphery. And so to some extent it begins in the classroom. And I mean, I was quite shocked, like when I first started looking at the etymology of pedagogy. It's paedagogas, which means being taken to school by a slave. So I mean, and of course, there's slavery in ancient Rome, but in a way the very thing that we think will teaching or education, which will lift us out of our misery, even that has roots in slavery. So I mean, I think decolonizing or developing sort of anti-colonial methods of thinking is extremely important, particularly for those of us who like English literature, and kind of figuring out how to decolonize our minds. I'm also kind of like, in the process of writing a book on pre-Freudian dream theory, where there's a huge body of literature by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Thomas De Quincey, Charles Dickens, Charles Kingsley, Virginia Woolf, Jean Ingelow, Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois, is Bengali early 20th century writer called Rokeya Shakabat Hussain. They're all about kind of they're dreamer activists. So they're all thinking about change. They're all thinking about modernity and the laboratory of modernity, but they're not thinking about it in very instrumental ways. They're, again, deploying unconscious methods to think about how do we arrive at modernity? Who are the discontents of modernity? What has not been included? So in Rokeya Shakabat Hussein's utopian text, Sultana's Dream, it's an English language text, and she's a early 20th century woman who's like an autodidact, and, she writes this utopian story. She's looking at a world where all the men have been ejected, sorry men, and women have an extremely eco-friendly world, kind of a nation which is anti-colonial, which doesn't believe in sort of subjugating other races, which doesn't believe in war. And keep in mind, this is written in between 2 wars. This is in the Great War and the Second World War, and it's very excitable about mechanization, which is one thing we associate modernity with, but it's removing mechanization from the war machinery. It's saying no way will this, the Queen decides that no way will this ever be used to kind of in a way instrumentalize war. So I mean, it's very interesting that this is in the form of a dream. It's a kind of a wish fulfillment that women will rule the world. They'll be so efficient that work hours will be contracted, and they are happy to keep producing children, but they won't look after them. The men are now put in mardana instead of zanana, so men will look after and they say that men get happy with it because they work for so long, they're very happy to be relegated to the household. So it's some parts are silly, but I think what's very interesting to me is that this projection about a more egalitarian society, which has to start with sort of in a way uplifting women before they can be equal. I come from I would say, like in those pernicious categories, first world country, where in my country, or the country I live in, the United Kingdom, the percentage of professoriate that is women of color is 2%. 2% of the professoriate is women of color. So, I mean, we are very far away from equality. All kinds of inequalities, even in so-called advanced developed societies. So I mean, the dreams are very interesting because it's 2 things really, and which I mean, I guess my psychoanalytic bent fascinates me. One is that the dreams are often associated with dreaming as we think of a better life, aspiration, utopianism, but they also show very interesting literary experiments that while they're very formally sophisticated and very clever, let's say, Virginia Woolf writing Haunted House as if she herself is haunted, as if she herself is hallucinating, the author, not Woolf, and but also kind of like really experimenting with what it is to suspend the mind, what it is to suspend the rational mind, which has led to nothing but war, which has led to nothing but conflict, has led to nothing but colonization, how to use that sort of the how to practice automatic writing. So I find that very funny, that suspension of agency while also writing these very clever works which look as if you have suspended agency. So that's my next book. But I would love to do something with you, and I'd love to do something. I'd love Unseen City to have an afterlife, because I think if you read the book, you'll see that this is not just something I wrote, to for academic fame. I very deeply and passionately believe in the cause of kind of working in the community, poverty alleviation through sort of, in a way, these kind of psychotherapeutic methods, or kind of different ways of engaging with the minds of the disenfranchised. So I would love to do something on that as well.
Yeah, and I hope the next webinar that we host with you, we have like a coming soon, and a peek into the kind of work that we're going to be engaged in together, courses or otherwise. It's very, very exciting. Since we have only 3 minutes, I think I can only take one question, which Vandana has asked you. Based on your research, where do you see psychotherapy headed? I think you can read the question yourself, but yeah, she's sent it to everybody. Can you see it, or would you rather I read it out?
No, I'm just reading it. Where is psychotherapy headed? It's a fantastic question. Thank you. And, as I said, I'm not particularly, even when I was writing my PhD and I was a nobody and I had no right to say anything about anything, I didn't say that psychoanalytic concepts are very useful for literature. I was saying literature has very interesting insights, which has led to a certain shaping of psychoanalytic discourse, that psychoanalysis has borrowed very heavily from the symptomatology of literature. What interests me about a certain kind of psychoanalysis is that the Freudian idea of the secular ministering of souls, that it's a secular ministering, it's not religious, and it is kind of really Girinder Shekhar Bose, who's called the father of Indian psychoanalysis, called it introspective meditation. And this bestowal of interiority, I think, is what fascinates me about psychoanalysis, that you're allowed to have an unconscious, you're allowed to have a dream life, and these are integrated. But that said, I'm also kind of with at every stage, I was questioning the kind of the tools of the geopsychoanalysis. The philosopher Derrida has a term, geopsychoanalysis, that how extremely North America bound it has become, and how it, what is it's very important for us to keep reminding ourselves that this is not some sort of a timeless discourse, but it's something that was created in the 19th century in Central Europe, So I think that kind of contextualization of where psychoanalysis came from is extremely important. I do think when I see the work of almost all the practitioners, many of the practitioners are psychoanalysts, when I see their work in the community, I do think there is much that they can do with expanding the idea of trauma, for instance. So, a lot of psychoanalysts, they show up how PTSD, the term PTSD, it kind of gained currency post the Vietnam War. The models are the Vietnam War and the Holocaust. So they can't, but, in a way, it's so prevalent that for a lot of NGOs to sort of, be part of that international conversation, to get international funding, they still have to keep using that blunt instrument to show, this is what is happening in this particular, post-Civil War population. But there are ways in which, psychoanalysts are kind of really pushing back and saying, but it's not just that, it's not PTSD. If you are, so, you have these cases in Sierra Leone, for instance, where women, because it's a kind of internecine war, between tribes who actually coexist. There's a woman who's having to live in the same house with a man who killed her husband because her daughter has married him without knowing he's the murderer of her father. And this is a very common scenario, in kind of post-civil war populations, because it's happening with people who are kind of, in a way, in the same community, if you will. So then it's not PTSD because the trauma is not over. Or let's say Sonia Falero's work with bar dancers in Mumbai, there's no post. It's continuous. It's continuing. So I do think that kind of not throwing the baby away with the bathwater, but taking this idea of kind of, a stress disorder, but also sort of like revising it, and taking some of the tools of kind of identifying PTSD, and identifying the ways in which departures from trauma can be devised, but also sort of revising it for the present, for a post-colonial present, for a present where war, trauma, violence hasn't ceased. So I do think that there are many things which are kind of, very usable about psychoanalysis that, we that can still be kind of used. And yes, as you said, I very much like, one of the things that really attracted me to the NALAM project is I very much like the idea of kind of lay counselors and barefoot researchers and your mobilizers, or, the peer support groups, because that is exactly the way I think. And this is something, when I was working with John Manush, the women would scold me. They said that this is not just work we do because we are passionate. This is our sense of livelihood. This is our source of livelihood. In other words, even the mobilizers are being empowered in the process. So not only are they kind of helping their own community, they are also being empowered. So this relay of empowerment, I think I find very fascinating, and it can work very well. That was the free clinic model, that you would train somebody in the community. The psychoanalyst would train a kind of a local, somebody from the local corporation. The corporation person would go to the community and train somebody who's a volunteer. And I like that sort of relay of kind of therapeutic techniques, which I also kind of really the conversations, the case studies that I selected from the NALAM group, I thought they were absolutely astonishing in the way the conversations happened, not just with the client, but also with the client's family, with potential employers, and throughout, this kind of rich, web of conversations that that were all about kind of, establishing this person as a citizen subject, that this person is not just a sufferer, but is going to have some money, will have a house, will have a source of income. And I think it can be very easily done with psychoanalysis if it has this kind of a community outreach. So there are sort of, in a way, the rule book is already there about how to do it.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. So I think Vandana has just posted her comments. So, we want you to do a series specifically on psychoanalysis in the free clinics and what happened in India, because I don't think that's very often spoken about. And Freud's contemporaries in India that you, so we, unfortunately, it's already 7:05. But this is a session that we want to do with you separately. But I'll schedule that again with you. But I think since we've run out of time, and I'm getting a lot of questions, but I think I'll have to pause and then email those questions to you, and we can share some of it on social media. So thank you so much, Ankhi. I cannot tell you how amazing it's been to meet you and to get to know your work, and more, and true to form at the Banyan, the more work that we can do together. There's a ton of things, and we've seen so much synergy with what you think and what we think, and we've been very, very intellectually stimulated by you, and what the potential of our work, of our engagement together. So I hope the audience had a lovely evening, and Ankhi, I hope you had a great time with this conversation.
I've had a most energizing time, and I'm sorry to have scared you all with stories of my heat stroke, but I have really had such a wonderful time. As I said, you have a deep-seated connection with this part of the world, and for me to come with my book here, and to again, to have glimpses of the great power. I mean, something I think Vandana wrote, I used that to end one of my chapters, that these are our teachers. I don't think we should think of ourselves as sort of helping anyone. We are being helped. Our humanity is being restored in the interactions. I absolutely loved my visit to one of the Home Again houses. I mean, the love, the concern, they wanted to know if I was hot, if I had eaten, if I wanted water. I mean, this is exactly the sort of thing, these are exactly the kind of people I want to know. I do think that these are the people I want to learn from at this stage in my career.
Absolutely, and it's going to keep happening. So I am going to stop the conversation here, and I'm going to see you tomorrow morning for more exciting work that we're going to do together. So thank you all very much for joining us, and have a good evening. Bye.